theme for this year is human rights. So again, I'm delighted to welcome you, students. If you are interested in making progress toward your global citizenship badge, please use the QR code to scan and get that badge. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reza Farkari, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. It is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Philip Alston. Professor Alston is an eminent scholar and practitioner of human rights globally. He has had an illustrious career at the United Nations. Among the many human roles over the past decades, he was the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, Special Advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Millennium Development Goals, and Chairperson and Rapporteur of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Dr. Alston is currently John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at New York University School of Law. He has previously taught at many institutions, including Harvard Law School, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Australian National University, and European University Institute. He has published widely, including texts titled International Human Rights and the United Nations and Human Rights, a critical appraisal. His report of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights on his mission to the United States of America was published by the UN in 2018, generating a lot of reactions and serious debates in civil society. He holds a Doctor of Science of Law degree from the University of California at Berkeley School of Law. He will present his compelling thesis on the criminalization of human rights to us today for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll take your questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alston to San Francisco.
Well, thank you very much, Reza, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not sure where they dug up that photo from. Actually, I am. It's me in Beijing, but the Chinese authorities made sure that that's about the only record of me being in Beijing, because there was no recording or video or anything else that came out of it. But anyway, so I'm going to talk today on a somewhat esoteric subject. I hope it won't be too specialized in a way. It's called the criminalization of human rights. The background, I suppose, is worth setting for those of you who are not well versed in the history of human rights. After World War II, where 70, 80 more million people died, the international community moved forward on a variety of what we might call humanitarian fronts. The first of those was to ban the use of force by states, which is the norm that we are holding against Russia today in relation to Ukraine. A state is not allowed to use force against another. Second, the laws of war, as they were called, international humanitarian law, was given a huge renewal and boost after World War II. Third, there was a system, if we can call it that, of international criminal law initiated, which started with the Nuremberg Tribunal, the Tokyo Tribunal in the Far East. And Nuremberg itself, the main trial, convicted something like 21 high-ranking officials. The United States continued holding trials, just US trials, which convicted another 1,400 or so in Germany. And the fourth humanitarian response was to set up the beginnings of the international human rights regime, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So you had the recognition in the UN Charter that every state was supposed to respect human rights, that there would be a formal statement, and that came in 1948, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that would be followed by various treaties building upon it, and a range of institutions designed to promote and uphold those rights. So I'm going to focus on the latter, the human rights system. It has to be said, first of all, that it was much more ambitious than at least most Americans would assume was the case. And that is so because it encompassed not only what the UN calls the civil and political rights that we're well familiar with in the US Declaration of Rights, but it also encompassed economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, most of you will be shocked to hear that they essentially came from someone by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not from Marx or Lenin, as is often suggested. During World War II, Roosevelt had given his famous State of the Union address saying that we need a second Bill of Rights in this country, a Bill of Economic Rights and Social Rights. And so when the Universal Declaration was drawn up, both of those sets of rights were included equally, not just the traditional rights. But the Cold War basically put an end to a lot of the efforts to promote social rights. The United States went back to its more traditional posture. It shunned and dismissed social rights, as I'll call them, as pro-Soviet, etc. And the regime of human rights has struggled ever since to really get the balance that is supposed to be there. But the assumption at that time, after the war, and the assumption in the human rights regime, is that you cannot meaningfully have one set of rights without the other. Now, I could talk about that at a length that would bore you all to sleep, in fact, but I won't. But simply to say that the notion that it is sufficient that people have the right to free speech, that they have the right to vote, and so on, is not going to guarantee a satisfactory life for an awful lot of people. And we see that in all of our countries. We see the extent of continuing deep poverty in Australia, where I come from, in the United States, and most dramatically in the Western world today, in the United Kingdom, which is going through a terrible time. The same applies, of course, on the other side, that you can't just have economic and social rights and have a decent life. You absolutely have to have freedom along with that. But the point is that we have to start with the vision of a balanced approach to human rights. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The argument that I'm going to put today, I said it might be a bit esoteric, but at least for those of us who work in the field of human rights, I think it is quite meaningful and quite problematic, is that we are moving from a broad conception of what the human rights are that we need to uphold and promote, to a much narrower range of rights that are being prioritized. And we're doing that primarily through the lens of criminalization. So I'll talk about a number of different examples to illustrate that today. But I thought it might be helpful to, even though I know that a lot of people here are not from the United States, but to start actually with a couple of analogies that are familiar to us in the US. And they relate to controversial issues, the so-called criminalization of poverty, and defund the police. The criminalization of poverty, I remember after I did an official UN visit to the US, Nikki Haley, who's about to announce her run for the presidency, said that I had picked on the wrong country and that I should really be looking at Africa because that's where all the real poverty is and we have no problems at all in the US. And she said, moreover, in no country, no state of the United States is it a crime to be poor. So she batted away, dismissed my argument that there was a criminalization of poverty going on. What do we mean by criminalization of poverty? It's really best illustrated by what happened. I mean, it happens all over the place, but when I went to Skid Row in Los Angeles, for example, what one finds is that there's a pretty large population of homeless people living in grim circumstances, thousands of them. And this is a problem for any society, that number of homeless people, the health and other problems that are associated with that. And so the response to it is essentially criminalize it. So I think on Skid Row in 2017, which is when I was there was something like 9 toilets for several thousand people. Where do you think you, to use the polite term, urinate? You think you stand in line for one of the 9 toilets? No, you pee on the street. Crime, arrest, fine. What happens after that? Well, it's just a misdemeanor, but you don't pay because you don't have any money. You're then summoned to the courthouse, but you don't go because you're not going to leave your trolley of life belongings in the street because they'll be confiscated by the police or stolen. And so, before you know it, you are in serious criminal difficulty, which then leads to the great outcome that you're no longer eligible for housing, you can certainly no longer get a job, and so on. The solution, of course, to homelessness is difficult. There's no magic bullet. But there's no doubt that the experts in the field, and certainly all the people I spoke to out in the field, prioritize getting a home, getting somewhere to live. And that doesn't mean a shelter. I suspect none of us would want to spend one night in a shelter. It's a grim situation, very grim, and often designed to be. So you'd have to spend money to start building housing. But the easy way out of it is to say we're going to take strong action. We're going to criminalize these acts, and we're going to put them in jail. And that's what we do. So the preference then is to go to criminalization rather than try to grapple with the greater complexity. And, of course, to invest more resources. Although the cost of the criminalization system is, in fact, enormous, as I'm sure you know if you've heard the statistics of how much it costs to keep someone in prison, how much it costs to arrest them, and so on. The other example which is even more controversial, is defund the police. Now, we've got the problem, which is staring us all in the face, and I don't think anyone would deny it these days, of pretty systematic police violence, particularly against black people. So the response to that, when things really hit a peak of awareness and outrage with the killing of George Floyd, was defund the police. And of course that has become a very controversial slogan. Many of the people who had supported it have backed away from it. It's too controversial, it's going too far. But we need to unpack it just very briefly. There are two responses to community, or to policing the community, if you can put it that way, two extremes. One is the criminal or the policing response, where you've got guns, you've got cops who are very well armed and who are going to go in and do what they think needs to be done. But of course, the great majority of the situations to which our police are called these days are not fit for policing skills, because the number of people who have mental problems, who have had social, familial, whatever, breakdowns and so on, and who are responsible for a lot of these incidents, that is not going to be resolved by a cop coming in with handcuffs, tasers, and guns. It's not a threat or an insult to the police to say that the problem is that we've simply designed our responses in a very lopsided way. So almost no matter what the problem is, call 911 and the cops will deal with it. And if you're a cop, that must be an absolute nightmare. The range of situations for which you have no training, no empathy, no skills, and suddenly you're in there, you're on the front line. You know, in some ways it's not surprising. They do what they're trained to do. They get out their guns. So defund the police, which, you know, is a very unfortunate slogan in some ways, is really designed to highlight the fact that if we're going to achieve a more just society, what we need to do is not to respond through criminalization and force, but to devise a range of different responses. And I think that's relevant to what I'm going to now say. So in the international arena, when I think of human rights, I actually think of issues that are what we might say inherently structural in nature. So Reza mentioned that I spent 6 years as the UN expert on what they call extrajudicial killings, in other words, unlawful killings around the world. And I went to a lot of very grim places and met, I don't know, probably thousands over the years of the relatives, parents, etc., of people who'd been killed. And one response to that is, look, we've got to find the killers and we've got to prosecute them and lock them up. And impunity is rampant, and that's terrible. But of course, there's also the big challenge: what do you do about the reasons why people are being killed? And if you don't address that, so if, I don't know, if you go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as I did, why are so many people getting killed? Is it because the Congolese are all maniacs and can't stop killing one another? It's resource wars. There are minerals, there are other very valuable products that everyone wants to get their hands on. What does the West do in response? Well, the West says this killing is terrible and it's got to stop. But the West also continues to buy all of the minerals, continues not to change the system in the DRC, continues to go along with the governing elites who are simply creaming off all of the profits. And one can analyze so many situations around the world where a lot of killing is going on, not by looking at either who is actually pulling the trigger or who's in front of the gun, but in terms of what is being done within the society more broadly, which is generating those situations. So when I think of human rights, and what I want to talk about today, are things like racism, things like sexism, things like the rights of children, things like the rights of people with disabilities. In other words, these are actually the really big challenges, as I see it, for our societies. Climate change. You mightn't see climate change as a human rights issue, but you will fairly soon. And it's not just because you'll be hit by storms and floods and fires and things. It's because you'll be hit by large numbers of people coming from other places who will have been driven out of their homes and about which we do nothing. And that in turn is going to lead to a traditional human rights crisis, because we're all going to respond in the usual racist, xenophobic way. I don't want these people in my home. Get them out. Go back to where you came from. We can't. It's disappeared or it's not livable. Doesn't matter. Get out of here. We're not going to support you. That in turn will lead to states of emergency being declared. It will lead to governments deciding they have to take strong-arm measures, and it's going to be, in the next 20, 30 years, a very different world. So my point is that this broader range of issues is where the focus really ought to be on. Rights of people with disabilities, as I said, is a classic example. Until 20 years ago, when was it, the American with Disabilities Act, probably, I don't know, was it 1998? Maybe I'm a bit late there. 96. Before the ADA, people with disabilities were treated like dirt. And in the great majority of places around the world, that's still true. If you have a disability, you're a less than human. You're less than a full person, and it ain't my responsibility. Good luck getting by. The last 20 years, that's been transformed thanks to the human rights perspective, which is that every person deserves to be able to live a full life. And if we have to, there's the petty examples in our own lives, so we've got to install ramps, we've got to install special bathrooms, we've got to do a few things like that. But this is in big, relatively wealthy institutions. What we're doing in society is not mirroring that. We're basically leaving persons with disabilities to struggle to survive, to struggle to get any sort of job, to struggle to get on public transport, and to live very diminished lives as far as we can make that happen. And so I will suggest that we ought to be focusing primarily on issues like that, and not only on the sort of issues that these days go under the title of atrocities. So I'm going to give you some examples of the ways in which we tend to focus most of our attention increasingly on atrocities. And this is awkward for someone in the human rights field, because atrocities obviously are pretty serious. You can start with genocide if you like, but you can then go down to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. These are serious issues. But what I'll try to argue is that by focusing excessively on those issues, we're actually missing the main game, and that's not unintentional, I would argue. So, the invasion of Ukraine is a terrible thing. We should do everything we possibly can. But in the human rights response, we've gone absolutely all out in a way that hasn't happened in relation to any other situation. So we have dispatched hundreds of human rights monitors to Ukraine from a range of different organizations. The UN has set up a commission of inquiry which is asked to identify individuals who are responsible so that those individuals can be criminally prosecuted. Ukraine itself, the New York Times reported some time ago that most of Ukraine's 8,300 prosecutors have fanned out across the country collecting evidence. The European Union talks about the need to set up a whole new tribunal to prosecute Russia's crime of aggression. Now, no one can, well, one can, maybe I should. I was going to say no one can question the importance of these initiatives. We have to push back against Putin's aggression. We have to bring some sort of resolution to the violations that have been suffered by vast numbers of people in Ukraine. And we have to try to hold key players accountable, including criminally. But that shouldn't be the main or the sum total of what we are doing in Ukraine. There should be a broader human rights response. I want to give other examples, and I hope these don't get too specialized, but there's a limited number of situations that the United Nations, but United Nations essentially means the big countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and others, have focused on in recent years. And they, in particular, Syria, Myanmar, and the crimes committed by ISIS in Iraq and elsewhere. And in relation to each of those situations, the United States and other Western countries, and I know there are students here from Germany. Germany has poured a lot of money into this, setting up what they call independent investigative mechanisms that are collecting all the evidence. And these mechanisms cost many, many millions of dollars every year. And what they're doing is trying to gather information which they assume will be able to be used for criminal prosecutions in the years ahead. So I don't know how many of, well, you will have some sense about Syria. So the ideal thing is that not just the president of Syria, but a lot of the people who are running the torture units and the prisons and so on would eventually be prosecuted. In Myanmar, Burma, as it used to be called, the idea is that the generals who run the military junta and a lot of the senior soldiers under them would be prosecuted. Now, we are spending, I guess, but the figures are not public, so I can't give you a figure, but it would be probably at least 100 million a year, I think, trying to lay the groundwork for prosecutions in those situations. So the dilemma that I have is that one could hardly think of people who are more deserving of prosecution than the key players in Myanmar and Syria. However, the reality is that most of them are unlikely ever to face a trial, and that any trials that do happen will be very far down the road and will produce relatively few convictions. We've seen that with the International Criminal Court. And it might be deplorable. It would be lovely to have a situation where we could simply issue a warrant, pluck out the top 10 guys, try them and sentence them to life in prison. It'd be lovely. But that's not going to happen. But it's where most of the resources are going now. Next example is, again, even more technical, what we call universal jurisdiction. The idea that you can charge someone for a crime that was committed with no connection at all to your own country. And so what we're seeing now in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands and elsewhere, are increasing prosecutions against Syrian officials for what are unavoidably pretty relatively low-level crimes, because you don't get your hands on the big guys. They stay in Syria. But someone who comes out as a refugee or whatever, you can nab and you can then prosecute. A lot of resources are going into that. Special offices have been set up in the prosecutors' offices in Germany and various other countries. Next example, sanctions. And this is a big issue. The United States has a long history of wanting to impose sanctions on human rights violators. And again, in principle, it's totally appropriate and understandable. But we've moved from realizing that sanctions on countries don't work, although we're still struggling with the outcome on that with Russia, to see if we can make those sanctions hold. But historically, most countrywide sanctions regimes have been a failure. They haven't brought the results that were wanted, and the relevant regimes have flourished despite the sanctions. So we moved a number of years ago to so-called targeted sanctions, which are now imposed on individuals. And so the United States has brought in something called the Magnitsky Act, named after a very sad case. He was basically a tax specialist or whatever in Russia. He started exposing some of the corruption that was going on. He was charged, of course, with tax evasion, and he died in prison horribly about a year later, Sergei Magnitsky. So we now have these Magnitsky Acts in the United States and in a number of other countries. On Human Rights Day, which is the 10th of December each year, of last year, the foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and the United States, Anthony Blinken, all put out statements to celebrate Human Rights Day. The only content in those statements was to say, we are proud to announce that today we have imposed new sanctions on individuals X, Y, and Z. And they come from Iran, from Yemen, from the Central African Republic, from countries most of us have never heard of. But we are really giving those guys what they deserve. They are sanctioned. They can't visit the United States anymore. Gosh. Their bank accounts will be frozen. Most of these guys are not actually Citibank clients, as far as I know. And so the point is that the idea of individual sanctions has actually replaced, in many ways, the need to deal with the complexities of a lot of these situations. I should hurry up. I've got to finish in 5 minutes. Some other examples. some of these are, well, a couple, but they're controversial again. Sexual violence. When I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it was just after Hillary Clinton had visited. And Hillary Clinton, I think, called it the rape capital of the world or whatever, and said this is the biggest problem in the DRC. There is no doubt that it is a very big problem in the DRC. What we've seen, however, is that when the international community, and by that I mean the US and other leading countries, but also the United Nations, when they deal with the problems of violence against women, particularly in conflict situations, the focus actually goes very quickly to sexual violence, and then ideally to prosecution, to criminalising. And again, you know, who could be a more worthy target of such prosecution? I met with quite a few of these guys in the east of the Congo. The problem is that in the DRC, if you speak to the people who have been driven out of their homes, who have been subject to all sorts of violence, including some victims of or survivors of sexual violence, what you'll discover is that the prosecution of the individuals responsible for sexual violence is not at all the main priority, and nor is it the action that is going to improve the situation. There will be a handful of prosecutions, although in a place like the DRC you could be reasonably confident that most of those guys will get out of prison very soon after they've been sentenced to life in prison. They won't be there for long. It's a sort of tokenistic effort. Again, to repeat, I'm totally in favour of it. They ought to be prosecuted. There's no excuse. But to make that the focus of so much of the effort that goes in is simply a mistake. And there are many feminist voices who have spoken out saying that moving from the oppression to which women are subjected in many countries to very rapidly saying yes, and we're going to prosecute those who commit sexual violence is an unfortunate move away from the main set of issues that need to be done into just one aspect of what the response ought to be. But in November last year, the United Kingdom had a very big conference. The Foreign Minister of the UK indicated that this was a big priority for the UK, which is not actually doing much on human rights these days otherwise. It's cut its human rights budget dramatically. It's not speaking out on a lot of situations. But sexual violence, we're big on that. US went along, committed $10 million for the next couple of years, and announced that it would start sanctioning these individuals. Visa restrictions and additional measures will be imposed. Briefly then, just to say, there are always justifications for prosecuting those who have committed atrocities. And I could list those, I don't have time now. It's absolutely important. I'm not here to suggest that it shouldn't be done. The trouble is that as it starts to take over the main focus of what we're doing, we run into a number of, I think, significant problems. First of all, the idea of what human rights are becomes distorted, because we then think of these terrible crimes, whether it's rape on a large scale, whether it's war crimes, whether it's genocide, whatever. And that then becomes the focus of attention. What is left out then is much smaller attention given to the whole range of civil and political rights violations that are occurring in our countries. Racism is just one example. Again, I could go on and use racism as an example. Just as I described the defund the police dilemma in this country, at the UN level, the case of George Floyd was taken. The UN announced that it was going to have a big inquiry into problems of racism, particularly in policing. But it's now going off very much in the direction of we need to have better ways to prosecute the police in countries around the world. And again, that ain't at the root of what's causing the problems. And prosecuting a handful of police, which is what it will be, in no matter what country, is going to make very limited difference to the situations that are giving rise to these problems. Next, if you focus on criminalization, it actually empowers a certain group. One, it empowers lawyers, it empowers prosecutors, it empowers judges, but it disempowers the average social movement activist trying to draw attention to their issues and not getting very far. Criminalization ends up targeting individuals and notoriously, of course, doesn't address the situation. So if you simply say, it's, I don't know, Saddam Hussein or whoever the big name is, removing that person or prosecuting them ain't going to change the whole system that gave rise to that. It brings a geopolitical distortion because atrocities, in the way we define them, are committed in the global south and not in the global north. Now that's convenient for us because we are not then looking at problems of systemic racism, systemic misogyny, if that's how you want to define it, and so on. And finally, there is obviously the question of resources, which I suppose is one of the things that worries me most. It's both the human resources and the financial resources. That all of these efforts to criminalize, admirable as they are on their own, cost a lot of money. And the budgets for regular human rights programs, for efforts to try to bring about more systemic change, are shrinking. And governments are focusing ever less on them. So all I want to say, just in conclusion, is that the starting point to address this is just to be aware of what's happening, to acknowledge it. But I think we also need to move the human rights community to addressing more systematically what I would call the structural underpinnings of these human rights violations. And that's what we're not good at doing, because that gets us into the really hard problems, including redistribution of resources. So that as inequality grows in the United States, and as more and more political power, along with the economic power, goes to wealthy elites, that also challenges the likelihood that we will have in place a meaningful human rights system. So those of us engaged in human rights need to ask ourselves, atrocities, yes, it's important, draw attention to them, but is that all we're doing, or are we looking underneath them to identify the problems that are causing those atrocities? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Some of the questions that are going to be asked are going to be more general and not so relevant to your presentation. Hudson, who's first asking questions? We have some students who submitted questions to Hudson, so we'll call on a few of them and then we go to the general audience. Maria?
Hello. Hello. I would just thank you for coming today and speaking about such a very, very important topic, especially regarding human rights and its criminalization, obviously. And so my question is more so concentrated around the question of Palestine. And I feel like everything that you pretty much said and argued is pretty complementary to what's currently happening with respect to the occupation. And so essentially what my question is the demonization of Palestinian oppression is an explicit display of the criminalization of human rights. How can we dismantle ethno-nationalist ideologies when recognizing flagrant violations of international law and human rights? And how can we also make sure that those who are the perpetrators of those human rights and international law violations are not only held accountable but are prosecuted accordingly in alliance with the International Criminal Court's definition of genocide and other crimes against humanity? And also, I have a follow-up to that. With respect to the United Nations as an NGO, the United Nations has proposed many steps to peace with respect to the Palestine question. However, when these recommendations and resolutions are consistently undermined, how can international law be enforced in order to address these imperative issues presented with the normalization of human rights with the normalization of human rights violations with respect to mobility, access to goods, and natural resources? So both questions are asked within the framework of the Palestinian occupation. Thank you.
I told you, I warned you. You didn't warn me of the content, but okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, these are obviously hugely important issues, and I could, I guess, come at them from a great many angles. Building on what I've just been talking about, one question is, and this is as much strategic as anything else, is if one is trying to get justice for the Palestinian people, and they clearly are not getting anything like that today, is the first line of attack to try to, or to talk in terms of criminal prosecutions against those responsible? We know that no Israeli leader is going to be tried. Now, of course, the Israelis are actually worried about the fact that the situation has been referred to the International Criminal Court. But my betting would be that there is no way on earth that the prosecutor of that court is going to risk the ire of the United States and other Western governments in order to bring a prosecution against a senior Israeli leader. So while I believe what is happening in the occupied territories is clearly a violation of rights on a great many levels, I think one of the biggest challenges is for us all to go back and think, how do we address this? Because what we've been doing so far has not produced any change. As long as you have a great power, if you like, the great power, determined to protect any country at all costs, that country will feel that it is immune to any criticism. And so Israel has no engagement with the United Nations other than to attack it. It is not accountable in any forums for its conduct. And that means that it's sort of almost uniquely outside the system. Even the United States has to answer for human rights violations that it's accused of. But Israel doesn't. Simply says, no, the UN is racist or anti-Semitic or whatever, and therefore we're not even going to talk about this. So there is no dialogue of the sort that there should be. I went to Israel in 2007 after the invasion of Lebanon, and I met with a lot of political leaders, Chief Justice. I went to I spoke to a lot of those who were involved, and since that time, very little progress has been made. I don't have an easy answer for you, but I'm confident that only focusing on criminalisation and maybe vesting too many hopes in the International Criminal Court is not actually going to change the way. It may well be that, in fact, as the Israeli elites overstep themselves, as they are doing right now, planning to dismantle the legal system, as we've noted, planning to, in the words of a great many Israeli commentators, to undermine Israeli democracy. That will be a step too far, that will then ideally force some sort of reckoning with the unsustainable situation in the occupied territories.
Hi, good evening. My name is Simia. My name is Simia. I'm a math teacher. I belong to the freshman honors class. I'd seen that you made a report on extreme poverty and it was dismissed by the Trump Association. But that ended up sparking a debate about human rights in the US. And I wanted to ask about your opinion on how the US would compare to other countries when it comes to human rights.
Basically how the US compares to other countries in human rights. Well, I mean, it's important to say quite genuinely that every country in the world has significant human rights problems. Well, except Australia. No, I make that joke because it's very easy for us all to assume that we don't have problems, but those other terrible countries do. But every country has human rights violations. They take different forms and so on. The United States has been a key player in the whole human rights system. I'm actually, this is a boring academic comment, I am currently producing a new, what we call human rights course book or case book, in other words, for students to study human rights. And the last edition of this book was some 10 years ago, and it's quite enlightening or revealing to see how much has changed. But one of the issues that I didn't devote any real attention to in the previous edition was the question of racism, which is interesting because the United Nations has done a lot about racism. It fought apartheid, it has had all sorts of treaties dealing with the elimination of racism, it's appointed experts, special rapporteurs and others. But when one looks more closely, one sees that there has been a very concerted effort by Western states in particular to constantly play down the issue in the United Nations context and to prevent consideration of the economic dimensions of racism, of the broader systemic underpinnings of racism. And there's been too much contentment just with a few resolutions and so on. The United States has been at the heart of those efforts to ensure that the UN system does not respond effectively to racism. Going back to, if any of you know the history of this, to W.E.B. Du Bois and the petition he sent to the UN in 1949, going back to Malcolm X, who was a great believer, believe it or not, in the UN, and thought that since he could not get justice for his people in the United States, it would only be if there was international attention. And he kept making the point, which I think is valid, that the United States is identifying all these other countries, South Africa, he used to talk about Angola, he talked about Soviet Union, and taking them to the United Nations because of their human rights record. But as soon as anyone tried to take the United States to the UN, the US would kill it, and did so effectively. So I don't think that the problems that the US has are necessarily very different from those that exist in many other countries, but I do think the US has been able to avoid the sort of accountability mechanisms that exist in other developed countries in particular. I mean, just one brief comment, because there are a lot of Germans here, I understand. It's quite shocking to someone from an American background to look at the number of human rights institutions that exist in Europe. It's not just the European Court of Human Rights or the Council of Europe, it's a whole range of other mechanisms. And so any European country, whether it's one with a good human rights record or a bad human rights record, is consistently subject to evaluation and critique by official human rights bodies in Europe. Consistently. In the United States, there's no equivalent. There's a Commission on Civil Rights, which ceased to be useful many decades ago. And beyond that, we simply say, well, the courts will handle it. But as the courts have given up on a lot of these issues and are not doing anything helpful, it's then back to the states. And there are no human rights mechanisms in the United States. And it's a dramatic contrast with what happens in other wealthy countries.
Hudson?
There's a back there.
Go ahead. Who's next? Is that Masonic?
Okay, so my first question was, like, this is like a very, it's about environmental capitalism. Do you think that this term, or like the name of it, is a misnomer?
What's environmental capitalism?
Oh no, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I don't even think it needs to be seen as pejorative, critical. I think it's just it's a description that our approach to the environment is driven by the imperatives of capitalism. That we simply have a deep commitment to never-ending growth, that there are no easy limits to that growth, and the environment is certainly not one of them. So I don't have any, I think it's just a descriptive thing. It doesn't give us the solution. There was a question down here, if the microphone is around. Yeah, the guy in the front.
And then the German students, if you have any question, please tell Hudson, and we'd love to take the question from you.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, Professor Alston, for your time and the very informative speech that you gave. My question for you is, how can the criminalization of human rights be effectively addressed through legislation and policy reforms? You brought up the war in Ukraine. I tend to think of that more of a proxy war. That's more of a function of this country's military-industrial complex, more than it is a human rights violation that has been fleecing this country for basically over 50 years. I mean, I think you've seen twice in your lifetime now that a Secretary of Defense has said we can't account for $20 billion in the Pentagon. Just what do you make of that? And just to tie it all back, how can, on a global scale, how can legislation and policy reform really address the issue of criminalization of human rights?
I think that those of us who think that human rights are important
have to be less easily persuaded that our governments are doing something when they come up with a solution that focuses only on criminalization. So I can give you another example, which I didn't talk about before, and that is human trafficking. So there's also a big movement called modern slavery, to combat modern slavery, and all of the developed countries now have legislation. They have a Modern Slavery Act. Yes, the US doesn't, but it's got its own variations on that. And human trafficking, modern slavery get at a range of issues. Some of it is sex trafficking, but most of it is trafficking of labor with a view to exploiting that labor. And so again, what we've done, you know, if I had the Australian Prime Minister up here, and I said to him, and what are you doing about human trafficking? He would say, no problem, my friend. We have a very strong act in force, and it prescribes massive criminal penalties for anyone who is convicted of this offence. Guess how many prosecutions there have been? I don't know the answer to that in Australia, but I'll bet you it's either 0 or a handful. And we're doing the same thing in the United States. It's criminalization, it's prosecution. We're going to get these guys. And a handful of people, you know, Chinese gangs or whatever, or whoever, will be singled out and given big prison sentences. But the problem of human trafficking is not only vast, but complex. And instead of doing anything about it, either domestically here in the US or in the countries from which people are being driven, is just too much. We don't bother. So I think the real answer to your question is greater awareness and a greater preparedness to just keep demanding that governments take constructive action in response to those sort of challenges.
Any of our German students have questions? Back there?
You're from Belgium.
Belgium.
No way.
I know, that's all.
Do you have the mic? Hudson, give him the mic.
I don't have no
The
question.
student did not have a question.
Oh, you didn't
No.
have a
We'll
question.
just say hello.
Who's next? Kadena has a question here.
Hang on, Mike.
When watching one of your interviews earlier this week, you referred to the American dream as the American illusion. And after the State of the Union that happened earlier this week, I want to know if your stance on that changed, or do you think we're in good hands with the leaders that we appointed lately?
Well, my comment about the American dream is actually, I mean, obviously it was seen as political, but it's actually just a factual one. In other words, that there is less social mobility in the United States than there is in almost all other developed Western countries. So, you know, the American dream that you can go from being incredibly poor to being incredibly rich, yes, there's a handful of cases, but the average person has less mobility in the US than they do elsewhere. I mean, I don't want to endorse Joe Biden for 2024 or whatever, but I do think that a lot of the legislation that was adopted during the last term of Congress is very encouraging and is starting to put money where it needs to be. So, yeah, it's the right direction.
Professor?
Thank you very much for this great talk with a lot of insight. I appreciate it. My name is Isa Kamyon. I'm teaching international relations here. During your talk, you made a very interesting connection between climate change and human rights. And you rightly pointed out how climate change can create human rights challenges. We already see, like, you know, the emergence of climate refugees, right? So, and their rights, what's going to happen to them? So, could you please elaborate on that connection a little bit more? and also talk a little bit about how the reformist approach that you seem to be proposing, as opposed to the criminal approach, would apply to the challenges that emerge as a result of climate change. Thank you.
I could reverse myself completely and say that it wouldn't be a bad thing if we criminalized climate change. I saw that some climate groups have actually brought individual prosecutions against directors of Shell oil company in the United Kingdom. And I think that might be a good wake-up call to the corporate world if it makes any progress, but the legal system is probably not going to encourage such efforts. I mean, I'm not sure what to say about climate change. The problem is that anyone who has studied climate change, who actually knows the facts, should be scared out of their skin. You know, I've already got 4 grandchildren. Their lives are not going to be anything like mine was. They all live in Australia, but I've also got kids over here who will no doubt probably have their own kids. The kids in Australia, the weather has changed forever. It's not the country I grew up in, and it's going to get worse, much worse. I think that's true in a great many countries around the world, most countries, but most of us are not concerned. The Ukraine war was a particular disaster in the sense that there was some momentum building about climate change until all that was taken off the agenda, because suddenly we desperately needed more energy. We licensed everyone to double down on their use of fossil fuels everywhere. And we're pretending that climate change is not, you know, this huge locomotive coming down the tracks really quite close to us. So where human rights fits into it, you know, it's a small part of the puzzle. I think those working in the human rights field need to start thinking through the scenarios that are going to come up. And you can pick any right you like. You can pick the right to free speech, because governments are soon going to start making inroads on free speech in countries around the world. You can't alarm people about climate change. You can't be too critical of what governments are doing, etc. If you take a right to health care even, there are what's happening, the absolute tragedy that's happening in Syria and Turkey right now has a lot of the hallmarks of the sort of natural disasters that climate change is bringing. And they generate very big sets of issues in terms of access to healthcare, access to health for the people who are there. How do we do that? What's the response of the international community? But more importantly, when people are driven out of their own communities and have to settle somewhere else, do we have systems in place that are actually going to enable them to access healthcare? Or is it going to be just focused on, no, sorry, you're not enrolled in this county or this state or whatever, can't help you. So there's endless problems, I think, that climate change will throw up, that human rights proponents need to deal with, but are not.
We are taking one more question back there. Go ahead.
All right.
Hello, my name is Nicholas, and I'm a senior. I got one thing to say. Like, when it has to do with like distributed wealth, like maybe the resources are like taken to like the elites. Like they should be taken to everyone else equally. That is like the main issue. If we give out resources equally, then we can help out the communities more often.
I don't disagree with what you say. The welfare state, as it's called in some countries, is generally understood not so much as an altruistic gesture, but as an insurance policy for capitalism. So capitalism, by its nature, creates winners and losers. That's how it works. It's not a critique of capitalism, it's just an observation. So what we do, at least in the United States, but also in many other countries, is let the winners take almost whatever they can, everything. And that percentage is growing by the day. And increasingly, we give the losers nothing. So the safety net that is there, the access to housing, good luck with most of you young people getting your own house, the way in which housing markets are developing around the world. It's all being locked in so that my generation will be immensely wealthy and younger generations will struggle greatly. There needs to be the sort of taxation system in place which is not punitive. You know, I'm not talking about 80% taxes or whatever, but a taxation system that taxes people who have immense wealth and transfers that not to miserable, grudging, stigmatized benefit payments for people who are barely able to survive, but to a system that ensures that everyone has access to healthcare, everyone has access to shelter, housing, however you define it. And that is the hallmark of a civilized society. The only way to get there is to have a debate about taxation, about redistribution of resources. And the United States became great because of the high levels of taxation after World War II. Vastly higher than we have now. And yet all the politicians in this country are constantly calling for reduced taxes. I'm going to drop taxes lower. Every time you drop taxes lower, you diminish what few public services are available, and you increase the burden, particularly on women. Lowering taxes is a great idea for a man, because the vast majority of care work, which can no longer be done by the state because it has no resources, falls on the shoulders of women. And so I think that coming to terms with the need for serious redistribution is the biggest challenge politically of our times.
Thank you so much.